The winter storm had arrived with an unforgiving fury. The wind howled through the skeletal trees, rattling windows and covering the small town in an unrelenting sheet of white. Snow piled high against doorsteps, swallowing streets and erasing any sign of life. It was the kind of night where people locked their doors, wrapped themselves in thick blankets, and prayed for warmth. At the edge of town, in a secluded wooden cabin, Mark Walker sat alone by the fireplace. The flickering flames cast long shadows on the walls, their dance the only movement in the otherwise silent room. He had long grown accustomed to solitude, perhaps even welcomed it. After losing his wife in an accident and watching his daughter drift away to her own life, Mark had come to believe that isolation was easier than facing the weight of loss. Then came the sound. At first it was faint, easily dismissed as a trick of the wind, but then it came again, sharper this time, almost desperate, a scratching, a plea. Mark hesitated, his fingers tightening around the armrest of his chair. He wasn't expecting visitors. No one ever came this far out in the middle of a blizzard. But something about the sound gnawed at him, stirring a long-buried instinct. Reluctantly, he grabbed his coat and walked to the front door. The moment he cracked it open, the freezing air slammed into him like a wall, stealing his breath. Snowflakes whirled wildly in the night, making it hard to see. But then, his heart lurched. A Malinois dog stood on his porch, her body shaking from the cold, her fur crusted with ice. Her sharp amber eyes locked onto his, filled with something he couldn't quite name, pain, exhaustion, and a silent plea. Beside her, barely moving, lay a tiny puppy, its fragile body half buried in the snow. In that moment, Mark Walker knew his life was about to change forever. Mark stood frozen in the doorway, the icy wind biting at his skin, but his mind was no longer on the cold. His sharp eyes studied the two figures before him, one a battle-worn Malinois, her ribs barely concealed beneath her matted fur, and the other a fragile puppy, its tiny chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. The mother dog, despite her weakened state, stood protectively over her pup, her amber eyes locked onto Mark's, filled with something raw and desperate. There was no aggression in her stance, no snarling or bared teeth, only exhaustion and pleading trust. She had come to his door in the middle of a storm because she had nowhere else to go. Mark's instincts took over. "Come on," he murmured, his voice softer than he expected, as if speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile moment. He bent down, scooping the tiny puppy into his arms, feeling how alarmingly light it was. A weak, pitiful whimper left the small creature's mouth, its body barely radiating any warmth. The mother tensed. Mark could feel it, her muscles coiling, prepared to fight or flee. She didn't trust him. Not yet. So he did something he hadn't done in years. He offered trust first. He met her eyes and stepped back, leaving the door open. He could have pulled her inside, could have forced the decision upon her. But something told him that this dog, this former warrior, needed to make the choice on her own. For a few agonizing seconds, she hesitated. The storm howled behind her, snow whipping at her battered frame. She glanced at her pup in his arms, then back at Mark. A soldier deciding whether to surrender. And then, she stepped forward. She didn't run. She didn't attack. She walked past the threshold with dignity, shaking the snow from her coat before lowering herself onto the wooden floor. Mark shut the door, sealing them off from the brutal world outside. Inside, the warmth hit like a wave. Mark moved quickly, grabbing an old blanket and gently wrapping the shivering puppy in its folds. The mother, he needed a name for her, watched his every move, her head low, her breathing heavy, but she made no attempt to stop him. She was assessing him, the way a trained soldier sizes up a new battlefield. As he laid the puppy near the fireplace, Mark got his first good look at her. She was built like a machine, lean, strong, and despite the thinness of her frame, there was still power in her muscles. Her ears, though stiff from the cold, flicked toward every sound, her eyes constantly scanning her surroundings. But what caught Mark's attention most was the faint tattoo on the inside of her ear. His breath caught. A K9 unit. Suddenly, everything made sense. The way she carried herself, the lack of fear in her eyes, the controlled, disciplined movements. She wasn't just any stray. She had been trained, conditioned. She had once belonged to someone. But where was that person now? Mark felt a familiar tightness in his chest. He knew what it meant to be abandoned by the system, to give everything for a cause, only to be left behind when you were no longer useful. He had seen it too many times, in men, in soldiers, and now, in this dog. He crouched down, careful not to move too quickly. "What happened to you?" The dog, Ace, he decided, didn't answer, of course. But the way she exhaled, slow and heavy, told him enough. She had been through hell. Mark turned his attention back to the puppy. It was barely breathing, curled into itself in an attempt to preserve what little warmth remained. He pressed a careful hand against its chest, relieved when he felt the faint, unsteady thud of a heartbeat. "All right, little guy," he muttered, grabbing a dropper from his medical kit. "You need to stay with me." He filled the dropper with warm water and gently pressed it to the puppy's lips. At first, there was no reaction, but then, a small twitch, a tiny attempt to swallow. Mark felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Hope. Ace crept closer, ears perked forward, watching with laser focus. He held his breath, waiting to see if she would let him continue. And then, after a long moment, she did something that made his throat tighten. She lowered herself beside him, resting her head near her pup, but she didn't stop him. She trusted him. Or at least, she was starting to. Mark exhaled, feeling something shift in the air between them. He wasn't just taking care of a dog and her pup. He was becoming part of something again. Hours passed. The storm outside raged on, but inside the small cabin, a quiet battle for survival was being won. Mark took shifts between keeping the fire strong, tending to the puppy, and watching Ace. She refused to sleep at first, her body tensed with the habitual vigilance of a soldier, but eventually, exhaustion won. As dawn crept through the frost-covered windows, Mark sat back, rubbing a hand over his tired eyes. Jet, the name had come to him sometime in the early morning, was still fragile, but stable. His tiny breaths were deeper now, stronger. Ace was asleep beside him, her body curled protectively around her pup. And Mark, for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. He glanced at Ace one last time before stretching his sore muscles. "Looks like you're stuck with me now." Ace didn't stir, but as Mark turned to leave, he caught the faintest movement of her tail. Just once, a single flick against the wooden floor. A small, silent acknowledgement. And in that tiny motion, Mark felt something shift deep inside him, something he hadn't realized he'd been missing. Belonging. He wasn't alone anymore. Morning arrived slowly, stretching pale light across the frost-laced windows. The fire had burned low, leaving a soft warmth in the room, and for the first time in years, Mark Walker woke to the sound of something other than silence. A faint whimper. Blinking, he sat up, his muscles stiff from spending the night on the old armchair by the fireplace. Jet, the tiny puppy who had been teetering on the edge of life just hours ago, had stirred, letting out a small, fragile sound. Ace was instantly awake, ears perking forward, her sharp amber eyes snapping to her pup. Mark exhaled, relief coursing through him. "Guess you're not giving up yet, huh?" he murmured, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Ace glanced at him, then back at her pup. She nudged Jet gently, pressing her nose against his tiny body, as if reassuring herself that he was real, that he was still with her. Mark watched in quiet admiration. This dog, this once powerful K9 warrior, had been abandoned, left to fend for herself and her newborn, yet she never stopped fighting. She had survived for him, for this tiny, helpless creature she had brought into the world. Mark understood that feeling all too well, the need to hold on to someone, even when the world had already decided to let them go. He stood, stretching his sore limbs. "All right, let's get you both something to eat." Ace didn't react much to his words, but as he moved toward the kitchen, he caught it again. That same, barely noticeable flick of her tail against the floorboards. It was small, almost imperceptible. But to Mark, it meant everything. By the time Mark had finished warming up a small meal, some softened chicken and rice for Ace, a delicate mixture of milk and broth for Jet, a knock sounded at the door. He frowned. No one ever came here. With a glance at Ace, who was already tense, ears high, body poised to protect, Mark approached the door and cracked it open. A gust of frigid air swept in, and standing on the other side, bundled in a thick coat and scarf, was a woman Mark hadn't seen in years, Emma Hale. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Mark took in her familiar features, the warmth in her brown eyes, the strands of dark hair escaping her knit cap, the way she studied him like she was seeing a ghost. "I heard there was a storm," Emma finally said, shifting a small bag in her arms. "Figured you wouldn't bother coming to town for supplies." Mark hesitated, then stepped aside, silently inviting her in. Ace growled low, her body stiffening as Emma entered, but she didn't move from her spot. Emma froze mid-step, her eyes landing on the Malinois curled near the fire, her puppy nestled against her belly. Mark watched the recognition dawn on her face. "You," Emma whispered, stepping closer, her voice barely above a breath. "I know you." Ace's ears twitched, but she remained still, only watching. "You do?" Mark asked, folding his arms. Emma slowly nodded. "I used to work with the K9 units back when I was a vet tech." She crouched down, carefully keeping her hands visible. "She's Ace," Mark said. "Or at least, that's what I'm calling her now." Emma swallowed. "No, her name was Sierra. She was one of the best." Mark felt something shift in his chest. Sierra, a real name, a piece of her past, finally falling into place. Emma hesitated before continuing. "She belonged to an officer, Daniel Mercer. He was—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "He was killed in the line of duty. Sierra was his partner." Mark's stomach tightened. He'd suspected something like this, but hearing it out loud felt different. "They tried to reassign her," Emma went on, "but she wasn't the same after that. Wouldn't bond with anyone. They said she was unpredictable, too difficult to control, so they retired her. She was supposed to be placed in a home." Mark's eyes darkened. "But that didn't happen, did it?" Emma's lips pressed into a thin line. She was abandoned instead." Silence settled between them. Mark looked at Ace, Sierra, who had been watching them the whole time. She hadn't moved, hadn't reacted. But her eyes, those sharp, intelligent eyes, held understanding. She knew. She remembered. But what hit Mark the hardest wasn't the fact that she had been left behind. It was that she had still chosen to trust again, to knock on his door, to take a chance on him. Emma, ever the caretaker, didn't waste another moment. She moved toward Jet, carefully checking the tiny pup's condition. "He's strong," she murmured, "but he needs more time, more care." Mark nodded, glancing at Sierra. "She's been doing everything she can." Emma smiled faintly. "Of course she has. She's a protector. It's in her blood." Mark felt something settle inside him. Something solid, something certain. Maybe Sierra had lost her past. Maybe Jet had been born into a world that didn't want him. But here, in this small cabin, they had something new, something real. Emma leaned back, her gaze meeting his. You could bring them to town, you know. They don't have to stay out here. Mark shook his head. No. He looked at Sierra, watching the way her body had finally begun to relax, how Jet was pressed against her side in perfect trust. This is home now, he said simply. Emma studied him for a long moment, then smiled. You always did have a way of finding the ones who needed saving, she murmured. Mark chuckled softly, glancing at Sierra. Yeah, he said, a quiet warmth in his voice. But I think this time, they found me. That night, after Emma had gone, Mark sat by the fire, watching as Sierra curled around Jet, her body finally free of tension. She wasn't a K-9 officer anymore. She wasn't a forgotten warrior. She was Ace now. Jet stirred in his sleep, his tiny paws twitching. Mark reached out, running his fingers gently through Sierra's fur. She didn't flinch, didn't move away. Instead, for the first time, she leaned into his touch. Mark felt something warm in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. Not just belonging, but family. The next few days passed in quiet determination. Mark fell into an unfamiliar but oddly natural rhythm, tending to Jet, keeping the fire strong, and making sure Ace got enough food to rebuild her strength. Though she had started to relax around him, there was still a lingering caution in her sharp amber eyes. She was watching him, testing the space she had found herself in. Mark didn't blame her. Trust was something earned, not given freely, especially for a warrior who had been left behind. Yet, despite her lingering wariness, there were moments, small, almost imperceptible shifts in her behavior, that told Mark she was beginning to believe in this place. Like when he stepped outside to chop wood and found her waiting by the door when he returned. Or when she let Jet climb over his lap, nipping at his fingers with playful little growls, without moving to take him away. She was starting to accept that this was home. But what Mark didn't know was that someone else was watching too. Someone who didn't belong. The first time Mark noticed the tracks, he dismissed them. Snow had begun to melt slightly under the weak morning sun, leaving soft, slushy patches near the tree line. When he stepped outside that day to clear a path, his eyes caught something odd. Footprints. They weren't his. And they weren't from an animal. They were too deep, too wide, spaced too evenly in the snow. Someone had been walking the perimeter of his property. His gut tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. Maybe it was just a hiker who had wandered too close. Maybe it was nothing. But when he went inside, he noticed Ace was already alert, her body tense, ears perked toward the door. She knew. She had sensed it before he did. Mark knelt beside her, running a hand over her fur. You felt it, huh? Ace didn't move, but her eyes flicked toward the window, toward the trees. Something was out there. Something wrong. That night, Mark kept the rifle close, not because he expected trouble, but because he had lived long enough to know trouble never announced itself first. The fire crackled low as Ace curled around Jet, her presence solid and unmoving. Mark sat nearby, eyes scanning the dimly lit cabin, mind turning over the possibilities. Whoever had been out there wasn't just passing through. They were watching, and if they were watching, it meant they were waiting. For what, he didn't know. It wasn't until just past midnight that he heard the sound, a sharp crunch in the snow, close, too close. Mark was on his feet instantly, moving silently toward the door. Ace was already ahead of him, body rigid, her ears twitching toward the sound. There, another crunch, a footstep. Mark's grip on the rifle tightened. Then, a shadow moved near the tree line. His breath slowed, muscles tensing as he counted the seconds. The figure was tall, dressed in dark clothing, moving carefully, deliberately, not lost, not wandering, looking. For what? For Ace? For Jet? For him? Mark's blood ran cold. Whoever it was, they weren't here by accident. Ace snarled low, a deep, dangerous sound rumbling from her chest, the kind of sound that meant she was ready to fight. Mark exhaled slowly. Stay. Ace didn't like it. He could see it in the way her muscles coiled, in the way she leaned forward just slightly, ready to lunge, but she obeyed. Mark stepped onto the porch, the cold biting into his skin. The figure froze. Then, they turned and ran. Mark didn't follow. Not yet. Instead, he looked down at Ace, whose eyes gleamed in the darkness, her body thrumming with adrenaline. "You still got that K9 training in you, huh?" he murmured. Ace only stared, her breath visible in the frozen air. And in that moment, Mark knew without a doubt. She had chosen to protect this home. She had chosen him. The next morning, Mark drove into town to find Emma. She was waiting at her clinic, already knowing something was wrong when he walked in. "There was someone near the cabin," he said, skipping pleasantries. Emma's face paled. "Did you see them?" Mark shook his head. "Not clearly, but they were looking for something." He hesitated, then added, "Ace sensed them before I did." Emma exhaled, rubbing her arms. "Mark, I think whoever abandoned her, they might be back." Mark already knew that was true. And he also knew one more thing. He wasn't going to let anyone take her. That night, Mark prepared. The tracks were still fresh in the snow. Whoever it was, they'd be back. So he and Ace waited together. Jet was nestled deep in the blankets, unaware of the tension in the air. But Ace? She was ready. She didn't curl up to sleep. She didn't relax. She sat by the door, eyes fixed on the window, muscles coiled, waiting. And then, in the early hours before dawn, a shadow, moving closer. Mark barely had time to react before Ace was on her feet, her lips curling back into a silent snarl. This time, Mark didn't stop her. This time, he let her go. Ace lunged, her speed shocking even Mark. She was across the porch in seconds, her growl slicing through the still night air. The figure stumbled back, clearly not expecting resistance. Mark stepped out behind her, rifle raised. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The man hesitated, then bolted, vanishing into the trees. Ace didn't chase. She didn't need to, because she had already won. She had made her stand. This was her home now, and no one was going to take it from her again. The sun was rising when Mark knelt beside Ace, running a hand through her thick fur. She was still tense, still alert, still waiting for a fight that wouldn't come. "You did good," Mark murmured. "Better than good." Ace let out a breath, finally relaxing. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time, she leaned her head against his side. It wasn't submission. It wasn't obedience. It was trust. And Mark felt something shift deep in his chest. Ace wasn't just some forgotten soldier. She wasn't just a stray. She was his pack now. And for the first time in years, he wasn't alone anymore. The sun had barely begun its slow ascent when Mark finally exhaled, letting the weight of the night slip from his shoulders. The warmth of dawn bled through the frost-laced windows, bathing the cabin in soft gold and pale orange hues. Ace sat beside him on the porch, her body still poised, ears twitching at every distant sound, but she was calmer now, no longer coiled like a spring ready to strike. She had won. This was her home now. Mark reached down, running a slow hand over her thick coat. She didn't flinch. Didn't pull away. Instead, for the first time, she leaned into his touch. A small gesture. But for a dog who had spent so long fighting for survival, it was everything. "You're not just a soldier anymore," Mark murmured, his voice low. "You're family." Ace didn't move, but her tail flicked once against the porch floorboards. And just like that, the wariness that had clung to the space between them began to dissolve. Inside, Jet had woken, letting out a high-pitched yawn before tumbling onto his paws. He was stronger now, still small, still fragile, but filled with life in a way he hadn't been before. Mark watched as the tiny pup tried to follow Ace, his unsteady legs stumbling over the wooden floor. He had never seen a creature so determined to keep up with its mother. Ace turned, nudging him gently, then stepped aside, allowing him to find his balance on his own. Mark smiled. Teaching him to stand on his own already, huh? Ace shot him a look as if saying, "He'll have to learn someday." Mark chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, I guess we all do." As he crouched to check on Jet, his mind wandered to Emma's words from the night before. Whoever abandoned her, they might be back. He knew she was right. Whoever had left Ace, Sierra, to fend for herself wouldn't just let her disappear. But something had changed. Ace wasn't alone anymore, and neither was he. Later that morning, Mark made a decision he hadn't made in years. He would return to town. Not for himself, for them. Ace and Jet needed supplies, medical care, food, proper shelter. And if anyone could help him make sure they had what they needed, it was Emma. As he prepared to leave, he caught Ace watching him closely. She knew. She understood. And when he pulled on his jacket, she stepped forward, her eyes flicking from the door to Jet, then back to him. She wanted to come with him. Mark paused. "You sure?" Ace simply stood by the door, waiting. Mark smiled. "All right. Let's go introduce you to the rest of the world." The drive into town felt strangely surreal. For so long, Mark had kept himself away from the world, believing that isolation was easier than facing the weight of the past. But as he glanced at Ace sitting beside him, calm, poised, watching the road with sharp awareness, he realized this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about both of them. A warrior left behind, a soldier who had walked away, two souls who had spent too long believing they had no place left in this world. But maybe they had been wrong. When they arrived, the reaction was instantaneous. People stared, some whispered. And then, as Ace stepped out of the truck, heads turned for an entirely different reason. She was striking. Even in her weary state, there was something about her presence that demanded respect. The way she carried herself, the way she assessed her surroundings. She wasn't just a dog. She was a force of nature. Emma was waiting outside her clinic, arms crossed, her knowing gaze flicking between Ace and Mark. "You finally brought her in," she mused. Mark shrugged. "Figured it was time." Emma crouched slightly, her voice softer. "Hey girl, do you remember me?" Ace stood still, watching. Mark could see the war waging inside her, recognition and uncertainty battling for dominance. Then, slowly, Ace took a step forward. Just one. But for her, it was enough. Emma's expression softened. "Yeah, I remember you too." And for the first time since that stormy night, Ace allowed someone other than Mark to touch her. Later that evening, after Ace had been thoroughly checked, after supplies had been gathered, after Mark had let himself breathe a little easier, he sat on the porch once again. This time, with Ace sitting close beside him. Jet had exhausted himself playing and was now curled between them, snoring lightly. The sky stretched above them, endless and open, painted in streaks of deep blue and orange. "You know," Mark mused, running a slow hand through Ace's fur. "Emma told me your real name." Ace tilted her head slightly, listening. "Sierra." She didn't react, didn't stiffen, didn't flinch. But after a long pause, she let out a slow breath, not of fear but of acceptance. Mark scratched behind her ear, his voice softer. "I think you deserve a new one." Ace blinked, waiting. "One that's yours now, Not something that ties you to the past, but something that belongs to you. Here. She didn't move, didn't look away. Mark smiled. What do you say? Should we keep Ace? A beat of silence. Then, her tail moved just once against the wood. Mark exhaled, a quiet laugh escaping him. Ace it is. And just like that, she was no longer Sierra. She was no longer a forgotten soldier, waiting for someone to claim her. She had already found her place, her home, her pack, and this time, no one was ever going to take it from her again. The days stretched into weeks, and life in the cabin shifted in ways Mark never thought possible. Jet grew stronger, his tiny legs steadier, his once fragile frame now bursting with boundless energy. Ace? She had settled into something more than just survival. She thrived. No longer just watching from a distance, she now chose to be part of everything. Following Mark through the woods, guarding the porch, resting her head against his leg when the nights grew too quiet. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Mark didn't just exist in this world anymore. He lived in it, with them, with family. And as he watched Ace settle beside Jet, the pup curling into the safety of his mother's warmth, Mark knew. This was only the beginning. The first hints of spring came slowly, as if testing the world's patience after a winter that had lasted far too long. The snow had begun to recede, leaving patches of damp earth in its wake, and the once bare trees now whispered with the promise of renewal. Mark stood on the porch, a steaming mug of coffee in hand, watching as Ace and Jet moved through the clearing like they belonged to it. Ace, ever the guardian, kept a watchful eye on her pup, but she was different now. Her steps no longer burdened by exhaustion, her eyes no longer haunted by uncertainty. Jet, on the other hand, was all energy, bounding across the softened ground, his tiny paws kicking up bits of melting snow as he chased after a wayward leaf. He had grown stronger, his once frail body now filled with the unshakable determination of something that had been given a second chance, and so had Mark. He had spent so long running from the world, convincing himself that solitude was easier than feeling the weight of loss. But now, with Ace beside him and Jet tumbling through the grass like he had never known hardship, Mark knew the truth. He had never wanted to be alone. He had just been waiting for the right ones to bring him back. Ace paused, glancing up at him from across the clearing. The way she looked at him now was different. Not with caution, not with distrust, but with understanding, with belonging. Mark set his mug down and whistled softly. Jet perked up immediately, his tiny ears twitching, before sprinting toward him on wobbly legs. Ace followed at a slower pace, but when she reached the porch, she did something that made Mark's chest tighten. She rested her head against his knee, her breath warm against his jeans, and let out a sigh, deep, content, at peace. Mark exhaled, running a slow hand through her fur. For the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel empty anymore. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man who had lost everything. He felt like a man who had finally found home. At its core, this story is not just about a lost soldier, an abandoned K9, or a fragile pup fighting for survival. It is a story about second chances, trust, and the quiet, unspoken power of love. Mark, Ace, and Jet were all left behind in different ways, each carrying the weight of loss, isolation, and the belief that they had nowhere else to belong. Mark had shut himself off from the world, convinced that solitude was easier than facing the ghosts of his past. Ace had once been a warrior, trained to protect, only to be discarded when she was no longer deemed useful. And Jet, so small and helpless, had been born into a world that nearly decided he wouldn't get to stay in it. But fate had other plans. Through the simplest acts, a door opened on a stormy night, a shared silence by the fire, the steadying presence of a guardian who refused to leave, they found something they didn't realize they needed: each other. This story is a reminder that home is not a place. It is the presence of those who make us feel safe. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild, but it is never truly lost. Even the most hardened souls, the ones who have been abandoned, betrayed, or forgotten, can find their way back, with patience, with kindness, and with the right hearts willing to fight for them. Because sometimes, the ones who need saving the most end up saving us too. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.